Okay, good morning everyone. Just while people are logging on, quick sound check. You can hear me okay? Great. Okay, well, welcome to day 5 of the Roundtable for the Burrow Creek project. Today we'll be hearing from the Friends of Nyah and VMFRP Park. We may be hearing from Rodney Duffy. We haven't heard from Mr. Duffy as to whether he's intending to come along and present today, but there is certainly room in the timetable for him to do so. We have accommodated submission slots for Ms. Thornton and Ms. McKay on Monday morning because they had some availability constraints today. So we'll do that before the proponent provides its closing submission on Monday. Just before we go to Nyah and Friends of Nyah and VMFRP's submission, we've had a chance to read the technical notes that have been uploaded yesterday, and I just had a couple of questions of clarification for you, Mr. Forrester, that we might get out of the way now. Most relate to technical note B4, which is the one that's about project infrastructure within 30 metres of the waterways. The first question relates to the block banks. So can you just remind me or point me to where this is explained in the ER documents, why Bank 4 is being removed, but Bank 5 is being retained?
Thank you, Member Carlo. I think, if I might, I'll take that on notice, and perhaps if there are questions I can address quickly with documents to hand, I'll try to do that. But if it suits you, I'll make a list of these questions and address them in the document file tomorrow.
Okay. Look, even if we could get, I'm assuming that answers to these questions are relatively simple. If not, yes, we'll defer them to later today. But if any of your instructors are listening and you're able to get instructions on that during the course of the day, perhaps we'll revisit that just before we close.
Yes, a good idea. Thank you.
Now, we understand that project infrastructure has been located or co-located with existing infrastructure. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is to avoid impacts on native vegetation, and another is to avoid impacts on Aboriginal cultural heritage. I just wanted to understand whether that was in response to known cultural heritage sites or artefacts that are present, or whether it's based on an assumption that there's likely to be a higher occurrence of particularly artefacts based on, we know that within 200 metres of a waterway is where we often find artefacts.
My understanding is that it's been, at the very least, informed or validated by those assessments which have identified sites, artefacts, and of course the native vegetation we referred to earlier. As far as whether the consideration of those general principles first informed the decision to co-locate, I'll have to confirm instructions.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so that sort of follows on to my next question, which is whether more detailed surveys would be required to confirm that there are Aboriginal cultural heritage sites or artefacts located within that area, or whether you've already done that work.
And does that question refer to the area around existing infrastructure, in the sense of the possibility of moving infrastructure into otherwise proximate areas?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I understand the principle of, well, it makes sense in a way to use areas that have already been disturbed, because the risk of doing any further damage to cultural heritage that may be present is minimised. We need to balance that against impacts to the riparian corridor. So it would just be useful for us to understand whether it's because it's suspected that there may be cultural heritage present within that 200-metre corridor, or within that 30-metre corridor in particular, or whether there may be scope in the detailed design process to kind of do sort of further assessments and work out that you could actually move this particular section of the containment bank outside that 30-metre corridor without impacting on cultural heritage. You do, in fact, mention that there may be further opportunities to relocate some of that infrastructure outside the 30-metre corridor during that detailed design process. Do you think that we need, or that a specific EDS that requires that to be considered in the detailed design process would help, or do you think that that's already provided for within the EDS?
I can address that one now. In short, the basis on which the EDS are proposed and the current project design is proposed has been informed by that work that the committee is familiar with, including through the project development chapter. And insofar as there are some opportunities for, or the potential for, location of infrastructure in slightly different locations, that will always be informed primarily by those considerations that we've otherwise been talking about in the previous questions, in terms of native vegetation and cultural heritage sites primarily. Mm-hmm. The answer, therefore, is that the basis on which infrastructure locations are proposed, having been produced and derived from those processes of the avoid and minimise processes detailed in the relevant parts of the environment report, and having regard to the location of existing particular access tracks and infrastructure, is proposed by the project as representing the best balance of consideration of relevant potential impacts and effects. Ultimately, consistent with our Part A submission in respect of this project, and pardon me, I think it's the Part A submission in respect of the relevant clauses of the Swan Hill planning scheme, and the briefer remarks made in the context of the Nyah and VMFRP projects. Our submission ultimately is the extent to which the planning scheme identifies the 30-metre buffer in a sort of broad scale sense across all waterways has less bearing in the context of these projects than the specific considerations of those specific impacts regarding cultural heritage and native vegetation matters. And that's also relevant to the questions in respect of the geological stability and consideration of erosion and bank migration and so on, which have been raised, and which we'll address in that separate context. So in short, it's our position that the EDS as proposed, which primarily through EDS E1 deals with processes of avoidance and minimisation of impacts through detailed design, is appropriately focused on avoiding and minimising those relevant effects, rather than being deferential to or referring to the 30-metre buffer corridor. In my submission, it wouldn't be particularly helpful to require consideration of the 30-metre corridor, or to suggest that it should be elevated above consideration of those specific effects which have been closely considered through this process, and which would be closely considered through the implementation of the EDS. And that's particularly so where that policy is statewide and applied in that broad brush way. So as to the question of whether it's helpful, I've answered you in terms of whether it's necessary, and what perhaps might be the danger of specifying it in such a way which would elevate it. As the committee's seen in our day one EDS that's not been included, and my instructions currently would be consistent with that remaining the case. So our position would remain with the exhibited text. But it would seem to me that if the committee wanted to specify it, considered it beneficial in the sense of potentially enhancing the benefits of the projects, or being a relevant consideration in detailed design, it could be brought in as one thing to which regard should be had in the detailed design process, probably through that BDS E1.
My last question relates to technical note 5, which explains the reasons why more native veg is proposed to be removed as part of the Burra Creek project when compared to the Naya and Vinifera projects, and that provided some very useful context for us in understanding the sort of differences between the 2 project or 3 project areas. I understand the containment bank profiles in Burra Creek differ to those in Naya and Vinifera. Is that because, so they've got a broader slope and broader construction footprint. Is that because the containment banks proposed at Burra Creek are higher off the sort of floodplain than those proposed in Naya and Vinifera?
My understanding of this is, I'll receive furious instructions if there needs to be supplementation, but my understanding of this is that insofar as there's been specific engineering consideration and further progress towards our detailed design for Naya and Vinifera, having regard to all of the relevant considerations in terms of the banks in particular there and how they would be constructed and what they if is taken from the shared borrow side. It's been the case that there has been sufficient engineering input in particular to identify that those what I'll call the steeper grades for the batters and therefore the narrower footprint are suitable for the Naya and Vinifera projects. We're not at that point for Burra at this point.
Right.
But as I think the Burra, as I think the technical note 5 notes, that's one of the possibilities or one of the potential outcomes of the continued design work which would be required by the relevant EDS at Burra Creek. So it's not to do with the height of the banks as I understand it, rather it's to do with those other, simply the further progression of design work in respect of Naya and Vinifera.
Okay.
And so we don't rule it out in respect of Burra Creek, it simply hasn't been ruled in.
So would it be fair to say that the construction footprint for the containment banks for Burra Creek represent the broadest extent of the construction footprint that you might need, and you might, during the detailed design process, be able to bring that construction footprint in a way that's happened at Naya and Vinifera? That's
exactly right, yes.
Yes.
So the broader footprint is assumed because there's not sufficient confidence or certainty in respect of the provision of the narrower footprint, which would make it more consistent with Naya and Vinifera, or whether there would be some other footprint in between, perhaps a different batter. And so that's right. For the purposes of assessment of impacts, we've got the broader footprint, the most conservative footprint, and then the minimisation of that footprint and the minimisation of surface disturbance and so on would involve and would be required to involve consideration of narrowing it through EDS E1, as well as, of course, the relevant provisions of the incorporated document in respect of removal of native vegetation.
Yeah. And why is the design process, the detailed design process for Burra Creek behind that for Naya and Vinifera? Is it to do with the discovery of the wall-cool effect?
No, it's a matter which precedes that. I can't provide you any greater specificity other than that's simply where the 3 projects have got to. And as we've noted along the way, while we're bundled together in the ER central assessment package, that doesn't necessarily mean the relationship between all three sites is equivalent, or that there is a relationship in a direct sense. And so Naira and Vinifera are in large part handled together, given their proximity, or handled in a similar way, whereas Burra's just at a different point.
I mean, there is quite a distance between, I think it goes Naira, Vinifera, and then there's a bit of a different distance up to Burra Creek.
Yes, there is, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Another matter that I noted along the way, to do with the fact that Naira and Vinifera share the Burrow site as the native vegetation technical note notes, means that there's also consideration of various questions to do with the engineering and construction of the Naira and Vinifera projects, which are distinct to the Burrow project, but which are common between them.
Okay, understood. I'll just check in with member Brisker as to whether she has any questions in relation to those three technical notes that were uploaded yesterday.
Yes, I have a couple. Two of them are to do with the containment banks. One of them just with the containment bank tie-ins and the engineering purpose of those. And my question is whether that purpose would be equally well served by having the containment bank, the tie-ins on the floodplain side of the containment bank rather than the river side of the containment bank from an engineering viewpoint.
Thank you. My understanding is they've been designed having regard to the closest and appropriate higher point to tie into. So seek instructions as to whether there are any instances where there is such a high point on the floodplain. I suppose the other point which might be considered and which my client might have instructions for me on is the extent to which the tie-in purpose would be possible without tying into a high point. That is to say, what the sort of extent of structure would have to be to provide the to fulfil the engineering purpose in an independent sense.
That would be helpful. That would be helpful to understand that. And while we're on containment banks, the other question which relates to these technical notes, but also more broadly to understand the containment banks, is the elevation. Presumably the elevation of the containment banks is related to the full supply level for the maximum inundation area, but just to understand how high above that full supply level the top of the containment banks would be.
Thank you. My understanding, consistent with the other projects, is that there's a freeboard of 300 millimetres. I'll confirm.
That would be helpful.
And that is, of course, I'm talking about the containment banks away from the spillways and structures. Yes, thank you.
It would be helpful to know sort of key points, and if the spillway heights and things are known as well, to understand what they are.
Yes, they are. I'll just need to collate those locations for them. Thanks. Okay,
thank you. And then my third question, which relates specifically to one of the technical notes, technical note B3, the overall improvement on biodiversity. My question there relates to, yes, the paragraph 3, which says the changes presented in section 5 respond to the current understanding of the pre-regulation and regulated river inundation event frequency and duration, etc., etc. And I guess what we were hoping to have sort of a little bit more information on is in terms of what that understanding is, not only in terms of the hydrology, which, but also in terms of the hydraulics. So I guess what, so it talks about percentages of EVCs under different depth classes. So I guess going back to that discussion we had with Dr. Treadwell and the various interpretations that could be had depending on which of the hydraulic models was used and how that was applied, to have some more clarity in terms of what was actually used for that AOIB assessment.
Yes, thank you.
And I understand, I expect that's probably a question on notice.
Indeed it is. I've just finished taking it down so that I can get those instructions. Thank you.
Thank you.
It might even be something that can be rolled into the technical note that is being prepared to address the questions on notice we had to Dr. Treadwell. If you've got an answer to that later today, great. But if not, if we can roll it into that technical note, that would make sure we had everything in one nice consolidated spot.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, are there any other preliminary matters that the parties wanted to raise before we go to Dr. Kelly today? No? Okay, well, Dr. Kelly, we are ready when you are.
I just need a minute to get something off the printer. Thank you. I feel almost like I don't really understand why I'm giving this, what is it called, a final day submission or something? What is this that
It's
I'm
just
doing?
your submission.
My submission. Yeah.
Yes.
But here I am doing it. So I've looked back at the submission for VMFRP and some of the notes from that. But I'm sure you have access to that information because it seems like the borough one has been based a lot on, we're looking back at that information from the expert witnesses and the proponent and the submitters.
We certainly do have access to the submission that we presented to the NIRE and VMFRP roundtable, but today is really an opportunity for you to say anything else you wanted to say that was specifically about the Burra Creek project.
Yeah, and look, I suppose my hesitancy is that we are on a Zoom and I feel like there's probably not enough time to say all the things I'd like to say, but I'll do my best. So I did wonder, Member Carlisle and Member Brisker, did you have any questions or is it appropriate to make any comment after your site visit? I'd be really interested to know what you thought.
We don't have any specific questions after our site visit. Our site visit very much informed our consideration of the written material and the verbal material that's been presented as part of this roundtable. But we don't have specific questions for you in relation to the site visit.
Yeah.
I might just briefly add, Dr. Kelly, were you present yesterday when Member Carlisle gave a brief summary of the places we visited and what we saw?
Oh, no, I wasn't. I had to attend. The Minister for Health was here making an announcement at our hospital, and I had to go off to that for half an hour or so. So I must have missed it. I can listen back though. Thank you for telling me.
Yeah, we gave quite a detailed explanation of the site visit yesterday morning, and hopefully the recording from yesterday will be up on the Engage Vic website. So it might help you
thanks.
to listen back. It'll just be right at the start. So we did it in preliminary matters, and it'll be, you know, right from 10 o'clock.
Okay, I thought I was there from 10 o'clock. Today I went out this morning and the sun's shining and the sky is totally blue, and I was thinking it would have been a much better day today.
Yeah.
That's, you can't tell that. All right. This probably will seem a little bit all over the place, and it is because I haven't had time to edit it and tweak it a lot. But please forgive me if it seems that way. So at this stage, this could be the last submission we give on this ER Central. So I feel like some context of the history is always relevant and always on our minds, because it has been so many years that we have been working on protecting and enhancing these riverine areas as a local environment group that's set up in 1996. So that's 27 years of working on it. and all the processes that happen with interactions with government departments and NGOs and processes that occur in the public sphere. But this one in particular started quite a long time ago. And, you know, when Nyah vinifera was turned into, and all these riparian areas were turned into, in 2010, when the Labor government announced a suite of new reserves and parks along the Murray and Goulburn, that was a great occasion, especially for Nyah vinifera, which was allocated to become a jointly managed national park with the Wadi Wadi. Now that hasn't turned out to happen as yet, and 12, 13 years later, it still hasn't. The joint management hasn't happened. And in reflecting on why that possibly is the case, I can't help but think that there's a link between these projects and the obfuscation and delay in things like joint management. Because if we disempower the traditional owners, then there's less ability for them to advocate for country. And Burra is country for the TOs. I can't help but think on those levels of, you know, of course we colonized, and I can say we because it was some of my ancestors who colonized this area. But, you know, in 2023, that we are continuing to recolonize and disempower and destroy country and not fully listen to or take into account traditional owner aspirations really is at the heart of what Friends of Nyah vinifera work for and were set up on the basis of. And so that fills us with a sense of injustice and a sense of sadness. But it also is one of the main drivers for our continued willingness to keep at this and work on this in the face of unbelievable inequality and processes that have not enabled us to be heard or participate fairly. So a sense of divide and conquer has occurred with these projects, and you know that is not a new technique by parties that want to achieve some goal. A lot of the same characters are involved, interestingly. The people who fought against us back in 1996, who wanted to keep logging the forests of the Mildura Forest Management Area and the Mid-Murray Forest Management Area. Some of those same characters now work for the CMA. Some of those same politicians, National Party politicians, are still key drivers in this whole situation. And they're key drivers in the whole situation of Victoria not signing up to the new Minister Plibersek's Murray-Darling Basin Plan announcement on Tuesday. So there's been a lot of obfuscation. And with this particular ER Central, there were 14 submissions, which isn't a lot, and I think that reflects on some of what I'm saying, that there were only 14 submissions. You could say that most were against. Many of the submissions were previous staff of the CMA or had pecuniary interest. With a lack of information, many of the submissions for the projects were misinformed. So there were no submissions from the Swan Hill Rural City Council, and I wonder how many of the technical reference group meetings Swan Hill Rural City Council even attended. The planning scheme amendment takes it off the Swan Hill planning people, staff or council to have any say really, but the lack of participation I don't think is healthy. But a project that goes over so many years where you get staff turnover, that continuity of staff or councillors being able to really keep an eye on what's going on is difficult. The fact that we're leaving ecological restoration to engineers is very worrying. The timing and staggering of the EES and ER I've made comment on previously, and I think that's meant that making a different decision, it's meant that our participation is even questioned, whether, like, why are we even participating? It's a fait accompli, and your ability to make a different decision for each project is, I'm not sure how you're dealing with it, but it's awkward and interrupted, and perhaps that's why I'm the only one today giving a submission, or I think I might be, because some of the people who made submissions haven't even seen that it's worthwhile fronting up. So I feel like it's great that you did a site visit, but I'm not sure. In my experience, site visits usually happen with parties. To go on a site visit with no local input, no guide, TO guide or local environment group guide or some sort of local guide or guides, seems strange to me.
I just feel I should jump in there, and we're not going to interrupt you on the way through unless you invite questions on the way through. But I just wanted to correct a couple of assumptions in that comment about site visits. Site visits undertaken for matters like this, the default position is that they are unaccompanied. The reason we went through a quite extensive process of inviting comments on the site visit itinerary was in order to make sure that we had that local knowledge built into the itinerary. So the invitation that went out, I think it was back in April, after the directions hearing, to provide input into the site visit itinerary was specifically designed to ensure that we got local input in relation to that. That invitation went out to all participants, including any traditional owners who wanted to point out particular sites that we should be including on our visit. So the process that we've adopted for the site visit, it is no different, and it's certainly no less comprehensive than what would normally be adopted for a project of this nature.
Yeah, well, I think for each project you've got to be responsive to what's happening on the ground and with the people involved. And I mean, did you get any input from locals? Did you ask? Did you get any written?
We certainly asked for it.
I know you asked, but what I'm saying is the ability for me, I didn't give you any input.
No, but I mean,
did anyone?
We put an invitation out there.
No, but giving it didn't work. So it didn't work. So you've got to do it differently. Anyway, I'll continue. Yeah, unless you walk the land with the TOs, it's very difficult to make an informed judgment. The process lacks, and for that reason, and I'm not saying this disrespectfully in any way, but because, I mean, you don't choose the process. I'm not being disrespectful to you, either of you members or anyone at SIAC, but the process is not as legitimate. And I'm saying that as a local person. History will show that this process has been inferior, and although it might be the current process that Victorian government goes through, I think history will show that it is inferior and inadequate and unfair. Constraints must be dealt with. Otherwise, it will always be, I'm talking about constraints projects as part of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. Otherwise, it will always be pumping, and there will never be a natural overbank event going into these projects. They will be pumped events requiring pumps and fuel and electricity, and water for these projects will not be assured. The limited study of these areas I wanted to make a comment on. The level of knowledge, the confidence in what we heard from the experts during this these days of panel hearing, I don't have a lot of confidence, not because I am an expert myself, but just from the tone of what I heard. There were insufficient answers, unable to answer, whether it's about terrestrialization or lignum. There seemed to be a lack of overall understanding of hydrology, and because these areas have not been studied enough, these areas being remote, up in the northern part of Victoria and the southwestern part of New South Wales, they have not been studied enough. And that gives me no confidence of the ability to judge and assess these projects. Looking at the risks, it was only the investigation footprint was looked at. That the staff will not be put on to do adaptive management or all the monitoring. That is a very big concern. That these projects could end up being abandoned and just become stranded assets if we find out that the developers of these concepts and these models that it was wrong, that the information was wrong and the models were wrong. The almost arrogance to think that you can understand this complex ecosystem, this boom and bust system, is very typical of humans, to think that they can understand something so complex. And I think the need to call back Burra and look at the war-cool effect, which, you know, that's a new term now, the war-cool effect, and we'll talk about that for a lot of years. If only you could understand how special the War-Cool River was as the original path of the Murray, the ancient path of the Murray. Now, adaptive management has been used for years. This is what has left block banks in creeks like the Parnimmaloo and the Burra Creek. Adaptive management has left those useless, interruptive, probably illegal block banks that people historically put in those creeks to dam them. Adaptive management is what left them there, interrupting the flow of water, interrupting nature and ecology. So I think I said in the previous ER Central Panel hearing that adaptive management, you need a new name, because adaptive management does not have a good reputation. We urge you to recommend a new round of research post this recent 2 floods in 22 and now 23. A new lot of research by whether it's Jacobs and R8 that does it. There's plenty of money there, and to be thorough and to do the proper work that needs to be done, we need to add before construction, before sign off on the process, on the planning of the building, and we need research done. The due diligence needs to be done, and that should include a whole suite of new studies on each of those areas, ecology, terrestrial, etc., to be done post these floods. And that will end up being a baseline of information that can be used from now onwards with the latest equipment, etc. We must gather this information before construction begins. I ask, why not? Why wouldn't we do that? So Tuesday's announcement by Minister Tanya Plibersek now means that the urgency is off. The urgency that everyone felt. I described it as a freight train coming towards us, because it was always this sense of urgency that meant things were rushed. The consultation wasn't done properly, and there was always this sense of there's no time to do it properly. Timelines have been changed, deadlines have been removed. So although Victoria has not signed up, from what I gather, and it's still, I'm still getting my head around what was announced this week, but it seems as if the minister has given Victoria an extended timeline until December 26, and that to me means that there's time now to do that extra study. There's time to go back to the community where the community has not given its authentic consent to these projects, and VMFRP is one of those situations. Go back to the community. Let's pause, do more studies, talk to locals properly, think about alternatives. Let's see what 2011, 2016, 22, 2023, all those floods, what have they now, what do we have now? Let's look at the latest climate change projections. Let's look at the latest information and not make decisions on these projects using old information. The money may stop. So if Victoria doesn't sign up, the money may stop. What if we get halfway through construction and there's no more money, and the Victorian government hasn't got any more money to build these, to finish these projects, and we get a half-built project? So we destroy the habitat, we scar the land, and for what? What is the assurance that that will not happen? They must not be started without an assurance of the full money to complete them, so that would not happen, because that would be a terrible outcome. And if Victoria doesn't sign up to what Minister Plibersek is proposing, then I would say they're not going to get the money. Ironically, the money that has been paid to consultants, in this case, some of what is Jacobs and R8, has taken a big chunk of the money already. We would have liked to see more alternatives considered. How can you study a boom and bust system with 6 EVCs, 21.6 hectares of tree removal, 188 trees, including 76 very large trees. This is remnant. Think about how many very large trees have been removed from this landscape in the last 100 years. So many. This is a very highly cleared landscape. Even in my lifetime, I have seen farmland that included very large trees, and with irrigation development, farms changing hands, very large trees removed from paddocks. So these remnants are even more important. I can't express how important they are, the very large trees, because there are so few on the private land. The icon site mentality, to save a few and sacrifice many, has always seemed unfair. Even when we first heard about it back in the late, 2008 type of time. To perpetuate a sick system of taking too much from a river and feel noble to just save a few spots. Around the world, there are many stories of humans destroying rivers. This SDLAM deal with the plan is going to be one of those stories. What will our descendants look back and say about what we have done? Using the river in political point scoring, allowing powerful irrigation lobby and National Party to direct a river restoration. Sometimes I laugh about that, but then other times it just seems like a tragedy. Burra Creek has seen massive irrigation expansion over the last 30 years. Some very successful farms and a lot of change. And I think it was Drew King said, it is the start, Burra is the start of the change in the landscape from the mid-Murray and then more towards the drier lignum type areas. As you drive along the Murray Valley Highway, which many of you would have done, you look in towards the Burra Creek, and for kilometres and kilometres, this most beautiful, majestic, mysterious, winding creek you can see. And for many years it's been dry and empty, and to see it now full of water and spilling out into the floodplain on public and private land has been such a joy for everyone to see. What that will now result in ecologically will be very interesting, and hopefully is a real rejuvenation and renewal, so that the area can recover and heal from the millennium drought, which will scar our river system and its floodplain for many, many years to come. But it will recover. Nyah, Vinifera and Burra, as you've just said earlier this morning, are very different. And to put them in the same ER was odd, but it's what humans do. They like to put things in a group and then put them in a smaller group, and yeah. It's been very, we want to thank the scientists and who have researched these areas, because for many years we have called for research and wished there was more research done. So I want to thank each of the scientists and researchers who put time into this, whether they were the head researcher or just someone doing work experience. Every single one of them, thank you for your work and for what you've gathered to add to the knowledge that we can use to look after these areas. You would think that yeah, I was going to say about Burra, it has very few red gums, which very small amount of red gum EVCs. To me, it seems like overkill to put this expensive infrastructure here and then to overwater the area. So it's evident that we're going to water it more than it actually needs or has ever wanted, which just seems very risky and very problematic. So with all the money that's being spent on these projects, you would think that a whole lot of landscape restoration may have been developed, not just the installation of irrigation infrastructure onto part of the reserve system at 9 icon sites, but perhaps a whole of landscape restoration on the scale of which is being proposed more and more in ecological circles, and recently announced that it is being rolled out by some of the NGOs. Restoration, looking at all the issues, public and private land, that kind of concept could have been rolled out and would have achieved a lot more than these projects are going to achieve. 36 part of the SDLAM to remove 605 million litres from returning to the river. So these 9 projects are part of that 36. And quite a lot of them were not going to make the deadline. Some of those projects are being eliminated from the SDLAM, including Menindee. Minister Xing the other day cancelled 4 of these VMFRP projects. I mean, are we talking about restoration, or are we talking about political deals? And I really think we need to think about what these projects really are. The data and modelling used to manage water in the basin is complex and is often not publicly available. People like, I'm going to read some of the stuff written by others in regards to the ecological merit of these projects is contested, as is the scientific rigour of the proposed auditing method, and these projects should be abandoned in favour of reconnecting rivers to the floodplain. In its final report in 2019, the South Australian Royal Commission was highly critical of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, and these ecologically dubious projects have been problematic. I don't understand how you can analyse these projects' efficacy without acknowledging and also measuring the effect the offset will have. And I've tried to explain that many times during the hearings, as well as others have, that the context of these projects within the plan and the water accounting, it's natural for scientists to look at context. It's hard not to look at context. I'd like to make a comment about Parks Victoria. I really do feel for Parks Victoria because as a government department, it's very difficult for them to speak openly what they really think. So it's really hard for me even to say any more on that because I don't want to get anyone in trouble. But I think it shows the importance of a community group like ours, who is, one would say, independent. We are not bound by anyone. You know, we don't have a boss who's going to tell us off, or we're not bound by any public service code of ethics. We can speak plainly, we can speak honestly, and you know, when we say things, we don't make it up. We usually have heard it from someone else, read it, researched it. So I think what we say is quite valid. I wanted to talk a little bit about the issue of the traditional owners in the area and the fact that there is no RAP. I found it very difficult listening to the proponent speak on behalf of the traditional owners, and quite nauseating actually, with a pretense that they know what the situation is here. I think some of the behaviour in regards to these projects and the traditional owners over the years has been condescending, disrespectful, and the day 5 of the roundtable hearing for ER Central that happened in Swan Hill, I've written a transcript of that day, and I would like to read a couple of things out, but maybe I'll include that in my submission because it makes for
was this the traditional owner engagement day as part of the Nyah and Vinifera roundtable? That session.
Yeah. Good. I really feel for you deliberating because there is so much information you have to decipher and read and analyze. And I worry that you will not focus on that transcript, that recording, that you'll run out of time and you won't hear some of what was dealt with there. So I was going to try to summarize it for you. But I think what I'll do is to see if we run out of time, and otherwise I'll include it in my submission. Yesterday, Member Carlisle said the Warcool effect is doing what the project was aiming to do. And I think that I'm not sure what that means, but yeah, I'm interested in what that means, but I don't quite understand what it means. So I wanted to read out some of the names of the areas that are going to be sacrificed if these projects get built, and 605 less water is brought back for the river, is returned to the river. Murrumbidgee Junction, Gadsden's Bend, Pyambi, Boundary Bend, Narung, Manny, Bumbang, Pound Bend, Carina Bend, Invincible Bend, Pile Bend, Buchanan's, Gooseneck Bend. So they're all some of the areas that are not going to get a VMFRP project. And if we don't get natural overbank flows, those areas will perish. And that is one of the things that is not being taken into account in regards to the outcomes of these projects and what we would call yeah, I'll go into that later. So one thing Brendan Kennedy has said, Brendan Kennedy, who is a Tatty elder, he has said that these projects are, I think he said they're something like they're the last frontier of colonisation. And he explained that more in his, in the submission he made to the EES for Hattah and Belsa. And I think it's worth listening to that. With the timeline, it's interesting to see what the timeline is for these projects. And in 2018, there was very little understory and a very stressed canopy. And I think that's more important why we do need a new lot of post-flood research. So research done post, you know, it was last year's flood was such a big one. It was a 1 in 100 year or more flood. And to get some research done after that is so important. EV made a very good submission to the borough ER, and I think it's worthwhile highlighting some of what they said. So they propose that if some of the issues raised in their submission are not resolved, that the minister, a supplementary ER addressing the deficiencies must be required by the minister and prepared by the proponent before the committee finalises its recommendations. And we would confer with that. So they say that the project must be assessed in its broader factual and legislative context, and deficiencies in the ER must be addressed to ensure all key instruments are sufficiently considered, and that the committee must consider and make findings in relation to cumulative, facilitated and indirect impacts of the project as part of the VMFRP and the SDLAM, and that the committee must require further analysis and investigation of feasible alternatives, including proper assessment of the crucial role of constraints relaxation, because the Victorian and New South Wales government haven't had any political will to act on those, that part of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. Constraints relaxation has meant that we haven't got overbank flows because they limit how high the river can go at Turrumbry, and it can never go any high enough to allow an overbank flow. So the rivers run high to get water down to the almond farms, but it is never run high enough to do an overbank flow. So the river's been managed to keep water out of the floodplain and deny the floodplain of the water it needs. It's wrong. It's the water management has been purposely keeping water off the floodplain. So if that's called adaptive management, if that's the way the things are going to be done, we're not going to have a healthy river, no matter if these projects are built or not. EV's also said the committee must consider the environmental impacts of the project on biodiversity. And this requirement cannot be considered met based on general statements of overall project benefit, which are predicted and currently unrealised. And they say that the committee must require the proponent to properly interrogate critical assumptions that underpin assessments, including the extent to which adaptive management measures are appropriate to respond to uncertainties. So I think they've encapsulated what we also think, although they say it in a much more nuanced way than I do. So the Burra Creek demonstrates the highly experimental and uncertain nature of these projects, the fact that we had to reassess Burra and to irreversibly change the ecological character of the area with these projects is highly risky. Certainly, we would agree that further scrutiny of feasible alternatives and cumulative impacts within and outside the MIA is needed. So the legislative context and requirements under the Basin Plan and related instruments needs to be part of this assessment. The committee should consider and make findings in relation to cumulative, facilitated and indirect impacts.
Could I just clarify with you, Dr. Kelly, when you're talking about the cumulative impacts, are you talking about the cumulative impacts of each of the VFMRP projects, the 9 projects as part of the VFMRP, or are you talking about cumulative impacts in terms of those parts of the river system that aren't getting a project? So it's impacts on the system more broadly.
Possibly both, but particularly the latter.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
The potential impacts on biodiversity as a result of the project are significant. Vegetation removal, loss of habitat connectivity, and I think it was significant that many of the expert witnesses acknowledged that although species were not found, that they could possibly be present, but just were not found at that time in the field studies. I would think it was interesting too to note how much of the information in the expert witness reports was found from desktop studies and how much was found from field studies, and what percentage that was. That was the question I meant to ask. The residual risk rating for arboriculture has increased as a result of further assessment of expected flows at Burra, so that it's now a medium risk. And Mr. King went through, I think, the transition from lignum swamp woodland to lignum swamp and the possible drowning of additional large trees. Look, that has happened so many places in the Murray-Darling Basin, where you see wetlands with some dead trees because of the removal of normal hydrological situations. So the ephemeral nature of wetlands was removed, and the trees were drowned as a consequence. It would be so. I didn't think we would still keep doing that. But this Burra Creek project seems to propose that. Further assessment notes that this change is likely to impact some of the vegetation communities, flora and fauna species and habitats present at the site, and some of the EVCs inundated at frequencies above their recommended ranges. So I just think if we're going to do experimental, risky, expensive, invasive, damaging projects, we need to get them right. We shouldn't do them and then overwater and possibly damage. Is that any better than doing alternative things that have a better outcome? And it's a shame that this ER scope seems to, from interpretation of people like Jamie Piddock, alternatives were within scope. So the fact that the SIAC is seen to interpret scope as not including alternatives, we have written to the Minister objecting to that. The MIA changed with Burra. The new iteration of the Burra project has changed some of the MIA. The ER fails to mention specific scoping requirements relating to provision of native vegetation offset strategy. We think there should be offsets. So once again, I'm going to repeat that we don't have any faith in adaptive management because we've got so many examples of where it's failed, where it's under-resourced, where it's been practiced benefiting some areas and not benefiting others, being exercised more fully in some geographic areas than others because of, well, you would have to say distance from the head office. So the head office for this region is Mildura, and so Burra is a long way from Mildura. Scoping requirements require evaluation and identification of management measures that, in addition to protect design, could assist in maximising potential project benefits to ecological values, and other management measures to avoid and mitigate
Just mindful of the time, Dr. Kelly, it would now be an appropriate time for a break? Have you got much more to go? Do you need a break?
I'm okay.
Okay, how much longer, because we might need a break, so how much longer do you think you've got to go?
Well, a bit.
Okay, well, look, I think we'll have a break now. We'll resume at 11:30.
Yep, thank you.
You there, Dr. Kelly? Just a call out to Dr. Kelly. I can see you're in the participant list, but we can't. You need to just turn your camera and unmute yourself. Okay, we might just turn our cameras off while we're waiting for Dr. Kelly to rejoin.
Sorry, Member Carlo. I'm
That's
here now.
fine. That's okay. Okay, back over to you, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you. So I was finishing up there talking about the scoping requirements. And I did also talk about adaptive management. The environment report talks about flexibility and adaptive management as the method to manage and respond to matters, important matters such as climate, erosion, groundwater levels, loss of habitat, weeds, pests, and the understory plants, impacts on Aboriginal heritage places. But these key uncertainties, we would think cannot adequately be dealt with by adaptive management. And therefore, it is even more important to properly understand and resolve these issues prior to giving the go-ahead for these projects. Just to use adaptive management as the answer for any potential question or lack of clarity or threatened risk. After listening to the whole process for ER Central, Nyah Vinifera, and now, well, also EES, Hattakulkine, and now ER Central Borough, it's just been too many times that adaptive management has been cited as it'll be okay because we'll use adaptive management. Much more strength and clarity and diligence needs to be put around operational flexibility proposals. It may be better to consider alternatives to assessing project uncertainties. When talking about cumulative effects on all 9 projects, this was on day 1, I think, when Greg Hoxley said that EES West is still under assessment. On slide 21 of Greg Hoxley's presentation. Now, EES West is that, I thought that was one of the ones that Minister Xing had cancelled. So I'm not sure whether the slide was old or Mr. Hoxley knows more than the public, which I'm sure he does. I suppose that's a question that I had that I would highlight as maybe a question that could be answered by the proponent before the finish of this panel. So in regards to context, I have spoken about it before, but I think if we can refer to the submission by Jamie Piddock and Matt Koloff, their submission was from February, I think. Possibly February this year. So in their submission, they write a lot about the need to look at where the SDL-AM sits under the Basin Plan. And they quote the EES document, volume 1, page 1.4, where it says, VMFRP is a sustainability diversion limit adjustment mechanism project under the Basin Plan that would enable environmental water to be used more effectively and efficiently. End of quote. The SDL-AM is intended to reduce the volume of water to be returned to the environment by 605 gigalitres per year, with this volume to be returned to the consumptive pool for use by irrigators. The EES document, volume 1, page 2.16, states of the SDL-AM, quote, by implementing works and measures to improve the efficiency of environmental water use, the Basin Plan includes a mechanism that reduces the volume of necessary water buyback. In 2013, the Intergovernmental Agreement on Implementing Water Reform in the Murray-Darling Basin provided the opportunity for Victoria to put forward a package of environmental watering projects for development, approval and implementation under the Murray-Darling Basin SDL-AM, end of quote. What the Piddock goes on to say that what the EES document does not state is that the SDL-AM was initiated by Deputy Secretary Water in the Victorian Government Department of Environment and Primary Industries in response to concerns from the Victorian Government in 2012 regarding the proposed volume of water, 2,750 gigalitres, to be returned to the environment under the Basin Plan. Victoria and New South Wales had argued for the volume to be closer to 2,100 gigalitres. The original estimate of water savings was in the order of 650 gigalitres per year, later revised down to 605 gigalitres per year. SDLAM was further developed, discussed and negotiated with the Basin Officials Committee and by a subcommittee. By August 2012, the Victorian Government were promoting the SDLAM and requesting it be included in the Basin Plan as a means of saving water for irrigators and as a condition of their agreement to the Basin Plan. The then Victorian...
I've got to jump in here, Dr. Kelly, as this committee has taken the same approach as all the previous VFMRP committees, that the SDLAM, as part of that broader Murray-Darling Basin Plan picture, that's outside our remit. So we can't comment on the merits of the SDLAM. So I just ask you to kind of bring it back to the Burra Creek project.
Yes, thank you, I will. But I would refer you to that submission by Piddock and Colliff, because they do beautifully summarise where this SDLAM sits and where the VMFRP sits, because it was the then Victorian Water Minister and National Party member for Swan Hill, Peter Walsh, who was a big part of saying that the agreement, the whole SDLAM, as part of the final Basin Plan then, to stop irrigation water being stripped from rural communities and food and fibre producers and to achieve better outcomes. So I'm just trying to help to clarify that this context of where these projects sit and what they actually are is vital to understand. Because back then it was a part of getting it across the line and MINCO decisions in 2012. And I think that people are going to look at these projects in that context, and that's how the results of these projects will be, in reality, how they'll be assessed is in the context of that reduction in water for the river. And just to, I'm sure you do understand, but the irrigators' desire to cling on to every bit of water that was over extracted and over allocated is very strong. We're dealing with people here who have no sense of care for the environment or care for the public estate, ecology, nature, threatened species.
Okay, again, Dr. Kelly, we're just straying into areas that I'm not saying they're not important, but they're not areas that this committee has any remit to make comment or recommendations on.
Yep. So the VMFRP and these three projects, or one project here we're talking about, Burra, if it was a genuine attempt at floodplain and wetland restoration based on scientific best practice, it would be expected that this ER Central would include clear statements of the following issues based on widely accepted ecological response models. And I'm quoting here from Piddock and Colliff. So they talk about the driver pressure state impact response framework and list 5 things of what that would include. They're basing that and saying that that kind of framework has not been used here. Excuse me. So they say that the fact that these issues are not addressed in any detail or with any scientific credibility. This was what I'm reading from their submission to the EES for HADA. So they question that these projects are not restoration projects. In addition, phrases such as, yeah, they question some of the phrases used in the ER, in the EES, and it's been shown in many studies now that the offsets that these projects are going to achieve are not going to be deliverable because of things like climate change and reductions in flow in the river, but also because the original modelling estimates were over-optimistic and included volumes of water that were double counted. So we use the Living Murray projects. We talk about them a lot, but the assessment of those projects is still, we haven't properly assessed some of those projects. So to base these projects on the success of those projects, when each of these areas, for instance, looking at Walpolla, and then looking at Burra, and then looking at Vinifera, and then looking at Gunbower, or each of these areas is so geographically different to each other. So the cookie cutter approach, I think, is very inadequate here. The Burra project, like the other 8 projects, are not floodplain wetland restoration projects, but are untried, untested attempt to save water that can then be used to increase the volume of the SDL. That is, be returned to the consumptive pool for use by irrigators. These projects, including Burra, lack consideration of even the most fundamental principles of ecological restoration in their design. And Colliff and Piddock say in this submission, they call them greenwash. They're a political solution to an environmental problem that are not based on best available scientific knowledge, but on deal-making between MDA and Victorian government. And then they quote from Brett Walker's findings that the SDL projects in the Commission, the South Australian Commission, there is real doubt whether the supply measure SDL adjustment process can be considered to be based on the best available scientific knowledge. At this stage, the supply measure contribution, which can represent up to 543 gigalitres increase in the basin-wide SDL, appears to be the result of a highly uncertain experiment with the environment of the basin.
Again, Dr. Kelly, it's beyond our remit to look at the merit of the SDLAM. You've got to bring this back to the Burra Creek project. Yeah,
that was the final bit of that that I took out. So I'd like to make comment on the, I suppose, the lack of procedural fairness and lack of natural justice, the lack of respect. Why a project that is going to make such a big impact on that public reserve, Burra Creek, is dealt with by a Zoom meeting, and I don't think that has afforded procedural fairness. So if we think about what community groups up here, like Friends of Naya Vinifera, or other community groups, or if you think about what we have nothing. We have no money. We have no admin. We have no resources for this process, compared to the proponent, who is a large government body with a large amount of money, enough money to pay consultants with experts. We have not been able to do that. We have had no money, no support to participate in this process. And you've got to put that in the context of we've had pretty much nothing over the last 27 years. And then you've got to compare that to what support and resources have the TOs had. I mean, the TOs in this area have been unable to develop a RAP so far. Luckily, up in the northwest of the state, the First Nations peoples of the Miller Mallee have been able to very recently develop a RAP, which I applaud and think is wonderful. But why are there certain TO areas? Why are there certain TOs who the Victorian government has not assisted to develop RAPs?
So Kelly, you're just not raising issues that are related to the project. Again, I'm starting to repeat myself here. I'm not saying these issues aren't important, but this is not the right forum to be raising those issues. We can't do anything about them. We have a remit that's defined by our terms of reference, and that's to assess the impacts of the Burra Creek project. And I'm just going to ask you again to bring it back to the Burra Creek project.
Yeah, the only reason I say that is because you're going to assess the impact on cultural heritage, Aboriginal cultural heritage, and you're also going to take into account submissions and the adequacy and detail and thoroughness of submissions, and I'm giving you some context into why there may be.
Can I tell you what would be more helpful to the committee on that front? You have been quite critical of the process, that not just the committee's process, but also the proponents' process in engaging with traditional owners. Going forward, what do you think should be done differently if the project were to proceed that could address some of those shortcomings?
Well, actually having gatherings of people who may have alternative views, not being scared to come and meet with people locally, not playing people off against each other. Yeah, talking to local people properly, not there hasn't been a proper community meeting here since 2018. Not lying, that would help.
Dr. Kelly, you're getting into some dangerous territory there, accusing the proponent of lying. I mean, there's no evidence to back that up. I just caution you to be mindful.
I didn't say the proponent lied. I said it would be helpful if the proponent didn't lie in the future. You asked me what would be helpful for the future. I said,
look, I don't want to split hairs with you, and I don't want to get into a fight with you, but I'm just asking you, this is a public forum, it's being recorded, just
Yeah,
be mindful and respectful of the process and the parties who are involved in it.
yeah. I'd like to say hello to everyone who's watching as well. I was going to do that initially. So I think you know, you've got to understand in the context of where we are coming from. We have got lived experience of dealing with the different proponents, because it has changed over the years, and the different individuals. There's no, like, I'm not just making this up. We've got historic, you know, we've lived through this over the last 15 years from these projects. And I just wanted to talk a bit about, because there is no theme day on cultural heritage, just to reiterate some of the, while the break was happening, I tried to summarise some of the wording from the traditional owners, who are the same traditional owners for the Borough project. So they talked about cultural water, using cultural knowledge and seasonal watering, that they wanted to sit down and work things out, that there's that they're on the same page, that they want to be involved, that the way that it's happened so far breaches their cultural law and the way to do business, that some of them don't want regulators on their country, and that there are alternatives. And I think Member Ham, who was present on that day, he said we have come a long way, but we have a long way to go looking after and caring for country. So on that day, day 5 of the ER for Nyah Vinifera, Hilary Chapman presented, and I note that she didn't get to present for Borough. One request that we made was things like taking the community to the place where these projects are going to be made and showing us properly where the infrastructure is going to go, using maybe tape or pegs, so that the community can really understand what is going to be happening on the site. One other thing that I wanted to mention was a letter that was written to you, Member Carlisle, that was that mentioned which of the, I think it was from it must have been from, anyway, it listed the traditional owner groups for these projects at ER Central, and it said it was Barappa Barappa, Wamba Wamba, and Wadi Wadi. And what that made me think of was that I'm not sure why the proponent or gets which TO groups are involved wrong. Like, I don't quite understand why they would list Barappa Barappa for this ER Central, because ER Central is nowhere near Barappa Barappa country. It's not even a neighbouring country. So it just makes me concerned about the genuineness of understanding of who the TOs are involved. Now, yes, there are some contestability with who is Wadi Wadi or who is Taddy Taddy, but there's no contest about where Wadi Wadi country is or where Tadi Tadi country is. So listing Barappa Barappa as one of the TOs is just inaccurate. And I mean, it's not a lie, but it's definitely misinformation. It's definitely inaccurate, and it definitely shows a lack of understanding and respect for the cultural heritage. So I wanted to bring that to the attention. And, you know, it's also in the ER documents, just that inaccurate listing of who the TO, which, you know, on a map, you can see what the TO area is, and it's Wadi Wadi and Tadi Tadi. Nearly at the end, one thing that I saw in the ER documents in regards to Aboriginal cultural heritage was very little to do with the presence of scar trees, unregistered marker trees known as ring trees, and there were a lack of mention of reports by archaeologists. Some reports were noted and others were left out. And I think I've already mentioned before, the most telling indicator that the proponent does not see cultural heritage as important is that they did not put up as a theme, and they did not bring any expert witnesses to speak to the reports. So the ER has many, many pages of Aboriginal cultural heritage impacts and assessment, but this was not brought up as a theme. And I think that, as well as that, not having a wrap has put Wadi Wadi and Tadi Tadi at a disadvantage, one the proponents were happy to exploit. So if I just finish off by saying, just going to check if I've got anything further from the days. Yeah, I'd like to just finish off there by saying that I hope, we would hope that the war-cool effect is considered thoroughly, and that it brings to the attention of SIAC how complex the river system is, how the interactions between the different waterways, creeks, lakes, they are all interconnected, that there is so much variety in the way the waterways work and the different flow at different times. It is this variability and this interconnectedness that has created the incredible richness and biodiverse area, including Ramsar sites. And that imposing irrigation infrastructure to supposedly improve these areas is highly risky. It is permanent, unable to change once it's built. It will scar the area. And just that you understand that so many people are against these projects, including traditional owners, that we worry that it's made us, you know, so concerned over many years and caused a lot of stress and a lot of community angst, that the way these projects have been laid out and the consultation has happened has been very difficult and inadequate in the way that you would have seen that a bus with paint on it was brought down and parked at a local shop, and that was seen as top quality way to interact with the community. You know, that there are people down here who are highly knowledgeable, whether they're farmers, local people, field naturalists, those people have not properly been talked to in a way that as a group we could deal properly with these project ideas, that we were kind of separated and yeah, the way it happened wasn't good, and you know, we haven't appreciated that, and we haven't appreciated the effect that will have ongoing on our community, where you know, it wasn't done in a really open, transparent and accountable way, so that you know, systems where community groups could have dealt with things together and understood and then had input. So instead it's been a, you know, as I said before, created division and lack of certainty and suspicion, and a really bad vibe and a really disturbing and upsetting kind of process. And the fact that our local authorities like Lower Murray Water and the CMA could do that to us has been highly discouraging and highly destructive. So all in all, it's hard to pass over the ability to of what happens to your cherished and important public land that you take responsibility for as a community group, and that has, you know, been handed down from past generations, that you hand that over to a planning panel like SIAC to make a decision on, and then the Victorian minister and then the Commonwealth minister under the EPBC. I mean, you've got all these levels of umpires and checks and balances, but it's very scary and very disheartening and discouraging when you don't properly feel heard and you feel like there's injustices involved. So, yeah. Also, we already know that Hattah and Balsa have been approved, so that's kind of discouraging, because the ability for SIAC to make a different decision, the decision about Naia vinifera has already been made, but it's not public, so we don't know what that is. So, I mean, it's not the end, because there's still, I mean, anything could happen. The politics of it is that the minister, Minister Xing, Minister Plibersek, there's just balls in the air everywhere. And then there's the current economic situation, world economics, and Victorian, budgetary matters. They might get cancelled because of that. Then there's climate change. So it's all very complex, and I think that's what ostracizes a lot of people from even being involved in the discussion, is because it's all so complex that they shy away from even commenting. But just to reiterate that from our perspective, we do not agree with these projects. We object to them, and we will continue to do that. We are scared of them. We feel they're risky, expensive. We mourn that they will scar our remnant floodplain, which there is so few of, and we mourn the impact that it will have on our ability to enjoy that area and the cultural heritage. Some of the cultural heritage still is undiscovered and unrecorded, that we could come in on top of that and destroy what is still there, what remains, and that we don't think everyone has been able to have a voice in this process, but we think on the scale of things, most local people don't agree with these projects. Fishermen, bird people, traditional owners, parks management, most people really worry that what these projects will do. And please avail yourself of any further information that you would like to get from a friends group like ours. We would be very happy to assist you in any way you require. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Kelly. Any questions for Dr. Kelly from Member Briscoe?
No questions from me.
Okay. Thanks for your submission, and thanks for your input into the process. I'm just going to do a final call out for Mr. Duffy. I can't see him in the participant list unless he's in there under another name, but just to give you an opportunity, if you are online, to just raise your hand so we can identify you. Okay, it looks like we don't have Mr. Duffy with us. Okay, just before we, pardon me, close, just give me a second. Just before we close for today, Mr. Forrester, I thought it was worth going through the list of questions that we, and you may have got instructions on some of these over the course of the morning. So the first was why Block Bank 4 is being removed and Block Bank 5 is being retained.
Yes, Member Carlisle. Across the board, I've got instructions to answer each, save for the one that's been wrapped into Dr. Treadwell's responses, which were held back from filing at the last minute, so that should be with you soon. So okay. On this question about Banks 4 and 5, the updated project description is the easiest or central place that I can refer to in terms of where it is identified that 4 is to be removed and Bank 5 is to be retained. So that's found, should see figure 6.10, which is the figure with which the committee will be familiar, showing Bank 4 as removed and or decommissioned, and Bank 5 as a regulator or to be retained. And the reference then to, pardon me, I should scroll up to table 6.13, which identifies in respect of Bank 5 that Bank 5 is an existing earthen block bank with pipe and gate, which will allow operational access to facilitate the release of water into the Burra North WMA. As I explained earlier in the hearing, Bank 4, which is the bank to be removed, is now obsolete because it was historically used to support the watering of stock on the private property which is adjacent to or in proximity to its location. And my understanding is, my instructions are that that land use is either no longer continued or no longer requires the removal of water from or the taking of water from Burra Creek. Bank 4 is therefore an obsolete blockage in the sense that it doesn't serve any irrigation purpose or watering purpose, and that's to be removed. By contrast, Bank 5 continues to serve an irrigation purpose. It is a pipe with gate which is typically operated, as I understand it, or usually operated by an irrigation syndicate, which continues to take water from the Burra Creek to its south. And in the context of the project, it's understood that the pipe which is there is sufficient to convey the necessary volumes of water through the Burra Creek. And so the way the project conceives of its presence is that the gate would be operated if and as necessary to enable the inundation of the floodplain in the potential scenarios contemplated. So that description of the irrigation purposes or historical purpose of Bank 4 and present purpose of Bank 5 isn't contained in the ER. That's matters that were given to me as instructions, I think, on day one of the hearing.
Thank you for that. The next one was whether there's scope to have tie-in points, the tie-in points for the containment bank on the floodplain side rather than the creek or river side.
Yes, and the answer to this is that it's not clear. Okay. At the outset, I'll note the response as contained in the relevant technical note to the effect that the tie-ins are provided in order to tie into those existing high points or higher points in the surrounding topography, with that structural purpose of providing for the integrity of the containment banks. That process has enabled effectively the design of the tie-ins in a way which reflects the minimisation of new structures or new works onto the floodplain. It may be possible that there are alternative engineering solutions which could achieve a similar purpose, but further consideration would be required before I can give an answer either way in that respect. There might be some apprehension that if there was a tie-in extending as it is into the west, into the floodplain in each location, at I think the ends of Bank B and D, there would be a likelihood, given the topography, that any structure would start giving rise to additional impacts in terms of native vegetation and potentially by reason of an altered or a larger footprint. Mm-hmm. In that respect, I note the alternatives assessment in attachment 8 includes some consideration around the end of Northern D Bank in section 5.2.12, which I think the committee has in an unredacted form and which it might have regard to.
Okay, thank you. The next question was confirmation of the freeboard level on the containment bank.
And to answer this, I'll open the map book. I'm at PDF page 48, which is sheet 2 of the typical sections for project-wide infrastructure. The top 2 sections on this page indicate typical cross-sections for non-trafficable and typical containment banks of heights of less than 1 metre and 1 to 2 metres respectively. They are typical. Design will vary, of course, across the sites and from site to site, but they indicate the minimum freeboard of 300 millimetres to which I referred in my initial answer, to the top of the compacted crest. And then above that, an expectation of topsoil to a typical 150 millimetre height. So the typical freeboard to the edge of the crest gives 300 millimetres freeboard, and then an expectation of up to 150 millimetres above that to the top of the crest in its centre. And I understand that 150 millimetre minimum topsoil is generally consistent with what would be expected for the compacted road surface for trafficable containment banks, which would be expected to involve approximately 120 millimetres of a wearing course. So the freeboard there, or the height from the maximum water level to the top of the crest at its peak, would be 420 millimetres.
Okay.
In each case, the freeboard is above the design water level, which, as the committee knows, is 58.7 metres AHD for Burra Creek maximum inundation area.
Okay. Then we've got that matter that's being rolled into the technical note being prepared in response to the questions to Dr. Treadwell. We have one more request for you, which is just in relation to whether there's an option for some slightly more detailed mapping in relation to those containment banks. But I'm going to ask Dr. Brisger to talk to you about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the particular mapping I'm referring to is the map book. A package of maps was provided in document B30, which is the contours and LiDAR maps, which we've been having a closer look at since the site inspection. Particularly interested in maps 2 and 4, which show the Burra North water management area. So on those, there are contour lines with contours written on it, and some of the contours come very, very close together, and it's quite hard to see what number refers to what line. There is elevation shading on the maps, which currently is over a range of 0 to 200 metres, which presumably is sort of for the overall context. It would be very helpful to us if the elevation shading, if it's possible to compress that scale. So we've got elevation shading over the elevations of 55 to 60 metre AHD. So the different colours would really highlight sort of the variations in topography within the floodplain, rather than the topography of the floodplain within the broader landscape.
Thank you. Look, I'll seek instructions about that and how, when that can be done. I just wonder whether it might be, given some looking at it that I was doing a little earlier, the online, the GIS product, which was provided to the committee on a confidential basis in respect of ecological information, does contain LiDAR layers and I think contours. And I wonder whether any of that is useful to the committee, but I'll leave that there as a potential to be looked at, and I'll otherwise get some instructions on whether and when we can produce those additional maps.
Yeah. So I guess our key interest is particularly in that Burra North water management area, of looking at some detail of the topography and the, I guess, picking up the base of where the containment banks might be and the top of the containment banks and so forth, and making a few measurements.
Thank you.
And you'd appreciate it's difficult with the ones in that document.
Yes, no, I appreciate the request, and I'll if I get a response to you before we close, that would be good. But otherwise, we'll action it as best we can. The other question that I had noted down related to the preference to co-location of infrastructure with existing modifications to the floodplain, and particularly with a focus on Aboriginal cultural heritage. And I can address you on that now as well.
Thank you.
As the question, I suppose, acknowledged or presupposed, there has been that preference, and it is typically reflected across the floodplain here in respect to this project. As far as the information which initially informed that preference goes, the committee will have noted that the projects have been in development since 2012 or earlier, and along that path, it has been a continued preference to focus disturbance on sites on the floodplain which are already disturbed as compared with their natural state. And that is, of course, reflective of the desire to avoid and minimise environmental impacts, particularly in terms of native vegetation, but also on the anticipation that it is likely to be the case that the undisturbed floodplain will be more likely to bear instances of cultural heritage significance, whether that's through sites or other values, than disturbed areas. The way that that has been carried forward into the environment report is best reflected in attachment F, of course, in the specialist assessment in respect of Aboriginal cultural heritage. Section 21 of that document details existing conditions at Burra Creek, and that sets out existing records and investigations. It also describes predictive modelling, which was undertaken in the course of the development of the specialist assessment, and that predictive modelling itself is reported on, particularly in Appendix D, where maps of outputs of predictive models are included, and in Appendix E to Attachment F. And so that predictive modelling gives some indication to the committee in terms of what the proponent's general understanding of areas of higher likelihood of existence of those matters are situated, how they're situated, and where they are on the floodplain. Section 22 of Attachment F details the field assessments undertaken for the purposes of that process, and the committee is also familiar with the update in terms of the CHMP. Mapping of the standard assessment process and surveys conducted can be found in Appendix D in particular, and figures D7 and onwards. As that mapping indicates, and as the committee I think is aware from the text of Attachment F otherwise, the area which has been surveyed is the proposed construction footprint plus a variable buffer width beyond that footprint, with the buffer widths expanding, being larger typically at larger structures such as culverts and regulators. So the extent to which then options to relocate infrastructure, well, first, the extent to which those options have been considered is set out in Section 5 of Attachment 8, and the committee can have regard to that in terms of what that document identifies as far as potential to move banks and so on. But insofar as that attachment addresses feasible alternatives for the project and addresses how they were considered in the context of the balancing of other considerations, if it was the case that further alternatives were investigated or required to be investigated, any consideration of an alternative location outside the area surveyed for the purposes of Attachment F and the CHMP would require further survey, whether or not there are existing recorded sites. There would be a need for further survey, as well as, of course, consideration of feasibility in terms of meeting the project objectives and other considerations in respect of the native vegetation which exists on the unmodified parts of the floodplain. So I hope that that answers the question. I can't speak directly to questions about the understanding of sensitivity of or likelihood of occurrence of particular things within particular distances of other features, but I'd commend the committee, I'd commend the unredacted mapping to the committee. It will be able to reach conclusions on the basis of the mapping.
Okay. Well, you've given us all of the references to the documents that we need to go and check that and follow that up for ourselves. So thank you for that. Was there anything anyone else wanted to raise before we close for today? Okay. Well, we will resume on Monday, and yesterday we issued an updated timetable. So we've got Ms. Thornton coming in at 10 o'clock and Ms. McKay coming in following her at around 10:30 or so, and then we'll have Lower Murray Waters closing submissions. So we'll see. Okay, sorry. Thank you.